And we're live.
Finally.
I was just going to say, yeah, I just got to wear live as well.
Nice. Hey, y'all. How is it going?
Hello. It's going well. How are you, Kayla?
Hi, I'm doing good. I'm feeling all right this late night for me. It's your time, but yeah, I'm feeling good. I'm in the sort of final days of a Kickstarter campaign, so I do feel drained,
Sure.
but I'm feeling sort of buzzing still anyway.
Oh, that's great. Well, maybe we can tap into the buzzing energy and drive away some of the drained feeling here tonight. But yeah, welcome everybody watching, listening to Why We Roll.
Yeah, it's Why We Roll, game design podcast from Stillfleet Studio. I'm Wythe Marschall as usual, and Chris.
Hello.
Is Chris Pickett. And
Yes.
We're joined by a very special guest, Kayla Dice. We're so super professional. We rehearsed this. Of Ratwave Game House. I was thinking also just like the Ratwave, like just pictured all these rats arcing toward us.
A literal wave of rats.
Rolling dice.
Got a message from one of my girlfriends this morning, actually, who just out of the blue messaged me. Goes, "Hey, what did you mean when you called it Ratwave?" Because I'd always been imagining wave as like an artistic movement, like French New Wave.
Right.
But a friend of mine today said they imagined it as a spell. I cast Ratwave. I had to be like, I don't know if I thought about it that deeply. Or if I did, I have forgotten it because all of my thinking was purely, what sounded nice? What was the sort of
Sure.
sound?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I like that it can kind of inhabit different spaces at the same time. It could be a spell. It could be an unfortunate thing that happens in New York. It can be a literal wave of rain. It can be whatever you want it to be. I think it's nice and flexible that way.
Yeah, I definitely also did first hear it as like new wave.
That was my assumption.
Yeah. Vapor wave, whatever wave we're in. But just thinking about it again, especially living in New York and seeing videos of rats shared all the time, and individual rats also all the time. Although I've rarely seen more than one just creeping about. But
you should come over to our neighborhood at night.
Oh, I hear Greenpoint's the worst. Yeah, it's kind of famous.
Yeah, our neighborhood is so bad. We talking rats, Vex. You know it.
We're talking rats.
We're talking rats
in the chat.
Rats in the chat.
Rats.
I've told this story before, I think, but I mean, I've accidentally kicked a rat just walking home here in New York, so it happens. Yeah. Rat wave, it's real.
It's real. Well,
not as well. So I've dealt with a fair share of rat infestations, but I was still like, nope, this is the vibe I want to channel.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk a little about that vibe. Maybe it could be New York vibes, could be other places. But yeah, Kayla, why don't do you want to introduce yourself a little? Obviously, we saw PsychoDungeon. That's the reason we reached out. But I know you've made many other cool sounding games. So what brings you to sort of the world of professional game stuff?
Yeah, so my name's Kayla Dice. I have been making RPGs since I started around like December 2020 with sort of small one-page things, and then I guess I've been making all the way until now. Some of the things I've made in that time, I like really bounce around a lot between like genres and mechanical spaces. So I often describe myself as saying like, I often make work that focuses on the themes of connection and alienation in different ways. So that goes from like sort of solo games about sort of hard-boiled fever dreams to like belonging outside belonging games like PsychoDungeon's derived from belonging outside belonging, but also I made a previous game called To Embrace a Swamp Creature, to sort of bigger scale things like I released last year, partially last year, partially this year, a game called Terminal, which I described as a digital pirate action game about sort of dream hopping hacktivist sort of sci-fi pirates. At the same time, I think another thing I could be known for is like Transgender Deathmatch Legend, which was a card-based beat 'em up for 2 players. And yeah, these are all very like disparate things, but I think the thing that links them to me is often like the sort of not emotional through line, but a sort of emotional focus to a lot of my work, and I think that's definitely still very visible in PsychoDungeon, which I've been kickstarting since the 20th of May through to like the 20th of July. So I'm excited with how that's going. I'm going to be working on finishing that game up after the Kickstarter wraps. And yeah. Oh, also I was I'm an award-winning designer. I always forget to mention that, and then I end up doing it at the end, which always feels like a weird abrupt brag. But I was a Diana Jones Emerging Designer winner from last year.
Nice.
Congratulations. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the names alone are so evocative, and I feel like there is some sort of through line, and maybe we can talk more about that. But from, to embrace a swamp creature, I mean, it's a great phrase that feels like sort of a challenge to the player. And then obviously transgender deathmatch legend. I mean, really, like you want to buy it for the name alone. Same with PsychoDungeon, right? So I feel like you're clearly good at naming. I'm speaking of going back to Ratwave. You said you jumped around in mechanics. Can you say a little how you got started in RPGs? Was there like an initial game that you really liked, or like what led you to just try out all these things, these one-page constructions?
Yeah, so my start in RPGs, I want to say it goes back to like 2017, 2018 maybe. So it wasn't that long before I started writing things. It also was when I was quite decisively an adult. Like I had maybe like experience in like areas of role playing when I was younger, but not in like TTRPGs as the sort of structured text or whatever we understand. But and then I believe I so it was in around 2017. Someone took me to an indie games meetup in London, which still runs. Shout out to, I think it's just called London Indie Meet still. And so I want to say the first thing I played was like a GM-less cyberpunk thing. I'm pretty sure I've tried to look up what the game was, and I'm pretty sure it was someone's playtest that I don't know if they got around to releasing. Then other things I played were other sort of GM-less things. I think the first thing I played that had a GM was probably like a game of Monster Hearts. Like playing Dream Askew was probably like one of the still like first, if you're just counting different kinds of games, first things I played. So it's like, yeah, as well as like having come to RPGs as an adult, the other weird thing is that I came entirely like around D&D, so it's not an area I have much knowledge or understanding of compared to other sort of designers.
Yeah, I think most of the folks that we've talked to on here, definitely it was like, start with second or third edition D&D, and then you kind of like pipeline through in a very specific way. But it's really interesting. I mean, coming back to it as an adult, your first experiences with it again are GM-less games, and it seems like, that's the direction that you tend to go in as well. What was it about Dream Askew, as a kind of like beginning, almost formative experience? What was it about that game that really grabbed you?
I definitely think there was some area of like, this was at a point of me still figuring out what games could be. Like, then I guess just through cultural osmosis, I did pick up a bit more of the idea of like how a sort of usual GM figure and other stuff works. I think what attracted me to like role-playing games in general was this thing of getting to be a character and sort of step into a world. And I did find when I was sort of playing in more GM stuff, not always, it would obviously depend on a person, I could feel almost more sort of I definitely trying to phrase this in a way that actually makes sense to me. I Yeah, I'll just approach this from a different angle, actually. Yeah, I think what like really appealed to me about Dream Askew is I found like the setup of like how that responsibility was shared out in terms of like GM-less responsibilities, like the setting element stuff, really interesting. I found all of like the way the characters were laid out and presented really cool. And I liked the way it did sort of just drive story. So I remember I played Dream Askew, thought this was really cool. I think at the time I wanted even to go like, oh, maybe I should try and run like a longer session or something of Dream Askew with the friends I lived with. I think that didn't happen. I just think I ended up busy doing like comedy stuff or other things. And then I was like, up until like for those sort of 2 or so years, I was like, I guess more casually interested in RPGs. So like jumping from Dream Askew, I remember it was in 2020. I read through a lot of books I got in an itch bundle, and one of them was Sleepaway. And I remember Sleepaway feeling like this massive breakthrough because I was like, oh my God, other people made books like Dream Askew. That's really cool. Because up until that point, having not been someone who paid attention, just sort of checked in intermittently via like social media or friends, I wasn't aware of how that had grown.
Yeah, so it's like, you're like investigating this whole world, which is not D&D, which we've heard from other creators. And it's certainly, I mean, Chris, I feel like this is fair to say, what the reason we're like publishing and like interviewing people now is because of that whole other world, as opposed to the D&D side.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, it sounds like, it sounds like one of the things you might be interested in is sort of playing with those assumptions about how to be a character in a world. So, GM-less games. And then even looking just across, you've made so many games in a short period of time that all look really interesting. So I've not read or played them all, but using like cards as mechanics, using journaling for some are touching on other systems. Like you recently did something related to Hieronymus. We talked with Laurie O'Connell. But yeah, it seems like you're jumping around both genre and mechanic, as you said at the beginning. So that's, I think, it's interesting to me just because I always had the other impulse. It was always like this, terror of trying something that I wasn't as excited about as like the mechanics that I play around with my friends. But I noticed there are a lot of designers now who I think are taking this other approach of kind of like, let me work through every single, or let me think about all of the possible mechanics out there, which I think is just so rich and full of possibility.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's, if you can kind of, bring us closer to Psycho Dungeon. Were there some early games that you created that you felt were more successful, or mechanics you were like, more excited by, or, playtest experiences you had that were sort of gave you the hope or energy to like keep doing this? Like, how did you create so many games?
A lot of it, I guess, was time and different sort of stretches of unemployment. A lot of it, I think, is always like comes from very different angles. In like my sort of first year of playing games, I played a lot of. I made stuff as part of a lot of different game jams. So that was always kind of, I think, why I'm used to jumping around, is because a game jam would often be made sync in this. Like the first journaling I made was because it was like Follow Me in the Night, a Cursed Radio. It was a game there was a jam for Carter, which was a system for solo games. To Embrace a Swamp Creature, because that title is partially adapted from a Mountain Goat song title, How to Embrace a Swamp Creature. I originally made a very early first edition of that for a record collection jam, which was like Make Sync based on the title of something. Not the title of something. Make Sync based on like song lyrics. So that led me to experiment, and then I think I've sort of clarified what I aim for when I approach games, at least ones I'm really investing a lot of time into. I still am always having ideas, often just from like things I'm noticing or thinking about. But if there are, I think as I've gotten mildly further in, I'm more used now to when I can differentiate an idea and go, that's an idea I'm interested in actually spending a bunch of time on, versus that's an idea I think is cool and I should message that to a friend and then not do anything with that idea. That can just be thrown out away. But
I was going to say that kind of discernment is something that only comes with time, when it's just, when you stop doing every single tiny idea that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Psycho Dungeon, I can see a really interesting way. Like, I do feel like I build on stuff, though, also as well. Like, Transgender Deathmatch Legend, in spite of the fact that, like, I've joked sometimes to people, I think I'm spending the rest of my life and my career coasting off the title alone of Transgender Deathmatch Legend. The title wasn't the first bit. The first bit was I made a one-page game which had a cool way of doing fist fights that I had the idea with, that I just thought, oh, that's a cool way of doing a like fighting game thing. And then I remember thinking of that system and going, how would I make that not a two-player game? Or not a two-player game? How would I make that not like a fighting game? How would I make it in a different genre? And so then it became a beat 'em up, and then it became Transgender Deathmatch Legend. Psycho Dungeon, I can really see ways it is influenced by different games I've made before. So like To Embrace a Swamp Creature was a big BO, like Belonging Outside Belong game. I made a second edition of that same game with, I guess I'd say, like, at the time I made the first edition of the game, I'd read like Dream Askew and Sleep Away and some other things. And then by the time I made the second, I'd also read like Galactic 2E and Wander Home and taken in like a wider breadth of BOB games. So it built on that. Then Psycho Dungeon takes a lot of the stuff I did, but also mixes stuff up there. So it's a lot of the individual way I approached characters carries over. But then the differing roles and the grouping of setting elements, like that's something that I think there I'm building on the sort of asymmetric nature of different play roles that like I first did in Fear the Taste of Blood, which was a hack of a different system. I think a lot of the character sort of questions and building ideas in Psycho Dungeon do take stuff from Terminal, even though Terminal has both like dice and a GM and is a more sort of traditional game in that sense. But yeah. And then I also, like, in my mind, sometimes I think a lot of these things, because they're exploring such similar scenes, there's like, I guess sometimes I'm thinking about tone and returning to certain voices. I think Psycho Dungeon has a similar voice to Swamp Creature. It also has a similar voice to like a small zine I made about like escaping a really awful nightclub called the Infinite Dance Floor. So I think of those games as all related, even though one of them is way more mechanically linked, whereas the others maybe more thematically linked. But I think like voice and rules are two parts of it, so they're both sort of making up Psycho Dungeon.
There's a tonal connection between them, as well as, you know, just like where the actual concepts for the games are coming from. But for the uninitiated, could you tell us a little bit more about Psycho Dungeon? What's the kind of concept? What's the conceit? Where are we going?
Yeah, that would make sense. Psycho Dungeon, I describe it as a fantasy workplace action drama played with no dice and no masters. It's set in a sort of post-dungeon fantasy setting, like a modern world mixed in with magic and high-tech gizmos. And in this setting, in an individual city, we encounter all the own people who live there when their sort of troubles and traumas hit a breaking point. What springs from their mind is a nightmarish psycho dungeon full of monsters and traps and illusions, reflecting their own individual trauma. And when this happens, you call in psycho plumbers who come to clear out and close off the dungeon by helping you go down each steps, figure out sort of what it all represents a bit, and tearing that apart. And then over a game, you know, there's 3 different roles. There's the dungeon, just taking on like the individual environment and has access to moves where they can manipulate people's emotions and then try and use those successful desires it gets to lash out aggressively at people. Then any number of psycho plumbers who are all different explorations of different ideas, often around like work and their own sort of mental health struggles and being a bit alienated within a job. And then the client itself, who is the person who, at least for an individual job, it's massively focused on. Whereas then over a campaign, it brings way more focus back to the psycho plumber characters, which is a split I find fun.
That's so great. I was gonna say jokingly when you first described it, it really, hearing it out loud, having read everything available about it, it hadn't struck me, but it's like, oh, this just sounds like New York. It's like people seeking therapy, kvetching, hiring service workers who probably don't make as much money as them to like listen to them kvetch and like deal with their issues, but literalized. But I think in a deeper way, it's just such a striking and fresh take on RPGs to me, having studied a bit of Freudian philosophy via Deleuze or whatever in MacQuarrie. But it's like, here you have this great trove of insights that are in one way metabolized into like biomedicine, and people today rely on all kinds of different ways of thinking about the mind. But I feel like in games, I don't know, there's probably a lot of opportunity to like explore our own minds differently in games. And I feel like I haven't seen a lot of that in a lot of the more murder hobo fighting monster-esque genre of TTRPG. I have seen it a bit in some of the Dream games. Like I always think this game Dream Punk by a creator named I believe just Xavier is really, really cool and good. But I haven't seen a ton of games that kind of do that successfully, and I feel like it's a rich design space to play in. So I'm curious, and I definitely want to hear more, if it's not too spoilery, Kayla, if you can kind of take us through how the psychoplumbing works mechanically. And yeah, I would agree, with Vex, Songbirds has elements of it. I would argue Songbirds, it's not as clear what's going on. Whereas I think the psychoplumber analogy you've drawn, it makes it sound like it's easy to imagine, your head exploding with stuff, and then you got to get rid of it because like literally there's goblins from your mind or whatever it is. So I'm very curious to kind of hear some of the play tests or whatever.
It's also easy to put yourself in the shoes of a... Go ahead, Kayla.
Oh, sorry. I was just delay. Paprika of a Headspace via Persona is very accurate. And also, I think it works both if you mean Persona the video game and also Persona the Ingmar Bergman film.
Yeah, I was gonna say per se, like it could be the film or the game. I mean, it also like it strikes me as like very Borgese as well, if that's a word. Borgesian,
yeah,
Borgesian, yeah. The je to it, the little je to
the IAN, yeah.
I think there's an incredible accessibility for players coming into the game because the Psycho Plumber. I love that you chose Psycho Plumber and not making it more scientific or professional. Like it feels very like working class. Like, oh yeah, I could be a Psycho Plumber, and it kind of that workplace comedy bit of it really shines through in that and makes it feel like, yeah, I could just jump into this job and I kind of understand the class position that I've been put in this city.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I think I remember one of the sort of first starting points of one of the playbooks, it's The Wizard. The Wizard playbook was very inspired about the idea of like, oh, you do actually need like qualifications to become a wizard, and then it's a question of like, what if you regret this? Which I found as an interesting struggle. But the big conception for there was me just going, oh, I'd really like an idea of like wizard and magic where the focus on it is far more like played as like a blue collar job than an academic. So I like the idea of like, yeah, you go to wizard school, and wizard school is a vocational course you take. I just found it sort of like often I found it like a interesting way of like mixing that up in terms of like how psychoplumbing works in the game. That's actually a thing that ended up with a couple of different revisions. I wrote a big sort of early draft of Psycho Dungeon in, I want to say, it was mostly finished in October of last year, this initial draft. And then I left it a bit. I had other things to finish. I was finishing fulfillment of my prior Kickstarter terminal, and I had other things focused. And when I came back, I focused a lot more on what I thought of the sort of like structure of play, and how much sort of procedures were there and how they were aiming to be helpful, as well as how they could be discarded when they were maybe not so needed. And I think for Psychodungeon, some of that's like an interlinking between the system and like the thematic stuff. So like there's a very sort of like, because it's a more belonging, outside belonging derived game, like the way it is, there's like the structure of a dungeon delve is like on each floor you're encountering one that is inspired by a specific dungeon texture, which is like a specific issue. There's a building a Psychodungeon procedure where you are picking these individual like textures which reflect issues. So you might have a client and they go, okay, we're picking out as a table while we're like sort of creating this character in this dungeon. Okay, they're a university student, so we go, okay, we're picking the textures education because they're stressed about like the subject they're studying, they're not doing so well. We'll pick parents because maybe they would have liked to do something else, but we decide their parents had sort of pushed them in one direction. I'll pick social life because they've moved away from home. And then on each floor, as it goes down, we don't necessarily narrow in like all of the specifics, but the client is always looking for sort of an understanding on each floor. And as once they record that, they can descend. And a lot of the guidance is around the fact that, like, you know, psycho plumbers can prod at that. They can say, oh, you know, it did really seem like, what do you think it means that those monsters who were made of sand all sort of merged together and tried to suffocate you? Like, do you think that links to the worries you're having about trying to socialize? But it's up to the client player to say whether that actually works or not, whether that makes message, whether they understand that. The reason it's left open rather than necessarily like having like, I don't know, HP issues or whatever, partly it's just like about like fitting what is the system I wanted to work in, which was about like Dyson Masters, but also think it began to represent, it linked more to what I sort of thought the Psychodungeon represented, which is I looked at it as really being almost like an allegory for a breakdown, being at like a terrible lowest moment after loads of stuff has built up. And so a Psychodungeon being cleared doesn't mean, well, all of these issues are solved, because like a lot of these issues still exist. You maybe feel like, okay, I've got a bit more understanding, I feel a bit calmer. You know, it's helping someone like step back from the edge. It's not necessarily, it's first aid rather than deep surgery. And so that's why it's always just this thing of like, yeah, the client has the ability to say and pace the game and say like, oh, what they are taking from each individual floor. But there's, I think, like the stress for the psycho plumbers, as well as this idea of like, you know, you see people at their worst, you try and make them feel like there's like that things aren't as bad as they seem, and you let them go on their way and you don't see what happens to them. You don't necessarily get to know if it all worked. And like in the example I just riffed off the top of my head, like, yes, you saved this university student from the breakdown. They're still stressed about that exam. They still, you know, are in the same situation. The context of their life hasn't necessarily changed, and often that is what sort of causes more sort of mental health episodes. But they've managed to sort of take a step back and they're safer, and from there you hope for the best. But that's, I think, some of the grind for the characters is the fact that, yeah, you just are exposed to a lot of stuff, and you don't necessarily get the reassurance that people are going to be okay.
And they're sin eaters, right? They're taking on the trauma themselves to a degree over time, so they're getting messed up as they're helping out individuals without necessarily, to your point, solving all the problems in any sort of persistent way. They don't really know. And again, that feels again really true. I mean, to therapy or more broadly, you know, healthcare or any kind of care work. So it feels like a really fun narrative structure that, like, you could see being really repeatable as a TTRPG experience, because it's got a very clear like reason why you're doing the thing. It's kind of rewarding, but then to your other point, it's like you're not solving the world. You're not, you know, killing God or whatever, saving the universe. You're just kind of this like probably underappreciated worker. So I love how you've sort of balanced those elements inherently. Chris, did you have? I had quite more questions, kind of just about mechanics and sort of the play experience. But Chris, did you have?
Yeah, I'm also looking at mechanics. I do think that it's really interesting to think about the future of any psycho plumber. It's like, yeah, what do you do with that plumber that you've taken on? How do you embody that? But then also thinking about like how funny it is that they're, you know, in this fictional world, there's presumably a company or a corporation that runs the plumbers, right? And you know, you could even take it into a campaign narratively. Say, well, they want you to fix all of these people's problems. They want them to keep opening psycho dungeons because you have to have, you know, you have to have a market in order to survive under, you know, yada yada. Anyway, that's an aside. I am curious, Kayla.
There's actually a.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, because yeah, actually, as part of like the setup for play, you do answer a lot of questions, both about like really shading in the city a bit more specifically. There's fully just a note in the book where I'm like, I wrote this city as an analog to a fantasy London. You could definitely patch in any major city, because in the same way, I'm like, I 100% expect anyone playing it in America will map to their sort of closest city that feels like it embodies that. But another thing is, as I mentioned on how psycho plumbing works, and I draw a point that psycho plumbing was a public service. Like, you know,
it's been
enclosure.
It was a public service, and it got gradually privatized. I give its exact dates as, I say it started getting privatized after the 80s and was fully sold off by the new 10s. And you can draw whatever parallels to various UK bits of infrastructure I might be
sure.
There. But and then there's an option of you saying like, well, what is your workplace environment? And you do have like lots of things. You could be like, yeah, we're like a local authority, large firm that does this. You could say like, oh yeah, we've got like, this is kind of a startup. We work for a startup who does this. That's a bit weird. You could say, oh, we're actually like a small non-profit, and I guess we all like are in on this together, or like, yeah, with some faceless corporation who are mainly like paying out on people's like insurance. And then there's also the very grim note in all of this that like, okay, yeah, if you don't have a charity who's willing to help you out, a ability to have that money on your own, and you're unable to like have any other kind of insurance, the other solution for what do you do if you get a psycho dungeon is, oh, I guess you just have to go in yourself. And that's not what the game is necessarily focused on, because it's focused on people at their job. But in just telling a story about a world, even while keeping it sketch loose, there's these implications of how people are suffering.
Yeah.
I love how
the fun of science fiction, the constraints, and then what happens if this, then so if there's the literal dungeon, then can you yourself enter it? And you're like, yeah, sure, you could. Sorry, Chris, what were you saying?
Is it a physical space or not? Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I love that you give space for all of the players to contribute to that, you know, at the start of the play, but also, I mean, I'm assuming throughout the course of play. I am curious, are there separate roles for the client, or is that something that everybody contributes to? I mean, I know it's no dice, no masters, but how does that kind of break down in terms of actual gameplay?
Yeah, so with the free roles, I say there's like Psycho Dungeon, I ended up writing a lot of guidance about how you structure a session of play versus how you're structuring like an individual job. Like an individual job is like an individual dungeon, which you might do one in a session. You could maybe do more if you're someone who enjoys going way longer. So there's separated advice between there. I say within an individual job, you should have one person being the client, everyone else, not everyone else necessarily, but other people being the psychoplumbers, and they should probably stay static. With the dungeon role, I do say you could have a player do that, and that player is not a game master analog, because a lot of the responsibilities for pacing of the game are handed over to the client. Like, even if you are having a more static dungeon, it doesn't map straight to the game's master figure. That's one option. I also say you can pass around the dungeon role within an individual dungeon, like a setting element in various other sort of belonging outside belonging games. Like, those two options are presented there because I really do think that is just about, like, what's your group comfortable with? If I was trying to play this game with, say, some friends of mine who are more experienced only with more GM stuff, I'd probably have like the dungeon be static, and I'd probably do it and sort of just help like ease them in. If I was playing with people who either have like no RPG experience but maybe like a lot of improv experience or whatever, I'd definitely go like the rotating around way, and otherwise it's like mixing enjoyment. I do though make a suggestion though for like across a campaign or a longer sort of multiplayer thing. If you are playing longer, there's a suggestion of what I think is more interesting is if you have then every player playing make their own psycho plumber, and it's just that on an individual job, you're like, okay, who's going to pick the client role this time? Your character's like, maybe they're off sick, maybe they're on another job, maybe they're somewhere else. Like, you don't see everyone you work with every single day always. That's one way of doing it. The other is like you can have more static things. It just then influences how you structure other sort of scenes about like characters' surface life and stuff. But yeah, once like the basics of play are set up and everyone is up and running, Psycho Dungeon is a game that I think is very flexible in how the players choose to structure their individual acts of play and the procedures they build out of that. And I think it is a game that really sets you up if you're getting used to stuff, but also can absolutely benefit space for just like exploring.
Yeah, so you can kind of have not to put the GM back into it, but like if someone was always the client, like imagine an actual play podcast that did this for a season and they had one person being the client and the other characters were psycho plumbers. But I love that you have the rotational mechanism because I think that's really smart. And a lot of GM-less games or games, that recently we were talking about, Death Game came to mind where you're rotating through the experience of GMing with this kind of Squid Game scenario. So there's not one person who's the GM or everyone's sort of participating in being the part of the world that's oppressing the characters who are fighting in the death contest. So here you have the ability for everyone to be a worker, but you're also each taking turns as the client who really does need help. So it's kind of interesting to sort of share those positions and it me, right? I could also need help one day. So I think that's kind of cool again to have the narrative match like kind of the theme at that level.
Yeah,
Chris, did you? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the game also does very much have a trigger point of like, well, what happens if things get that bad for your psycho plumber that they are developing their own dungeon?
I mean, can you tell us what happens?
Distinct possibility.
Yeah.
It's a very straightforward thing. Like, yeah, you just because you work as a doctor, you're not immune to getting ill. Just because you did some counseling training, you're not immune to having an off crisis. So it's like, yeah, it's totally can play out just the same. There's then advice on how you build out what the dungeon for a psycho plumber looks like, how you go about like having an individual session where someone has the client responsibilities but has access to all their usual psycho plumber moves, even though they're probably not in the state to use them as much. And then there's the fact that like after you do manage to close off that dungeon, there's a sort of choices to your character of going like, well, what do you do here? It can be a big changing point for your character, like very sort of altered by this experience. Or it can also be a time where either you sort of like refuse to take it as a warning sign, or you push back and go, yeah, I'm done. Like, it's because it is like a workplace dramedy almost. Psycho Dungeon doesn't have an obvious ending, and I think some of the ending possibilities do come from, does your character quit their job or leave or somehow change their relationship to it in some way? And a breakdown is a great way to end up quitting a job, in my experience.
Yeah.
It's pretty surefire.
Yeah. I've quit a lot of
surefire
jobs
way to-
now because of dream goblins coming out of my forehead. And
yeah.
it's an impediment to getting promoted. Yeah.
It really does happen. I can almost imagine, a scenario where it's like a retired psycho plumber, and then the dungeon opens up. They can't keep it anymore. The dungeon opens up, and they're like, I try to get out. They keep pulling me back in, or like something along those lines, where it's like they go back in with the other psycho plumbers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's you're sort of more used to it, but it's still like the same play. It still like works the same. But yeah, I do think it's one stretch goal that we might hopefully hit is adding an extra playbook. And some of me is wondering about the idea of someone who retires and then returns. I don't know if that's what I'll explore with that playbook, but it's an idea that has been sort of brewing in the back of my mind.
Yeah, no, I like that. And maybe that's a good transition, because I did want to bring up kind of the Kickstarter, both to plug it, but also to as a kind of how-to question, or advice kind of question. I mean, we always ask about this transition toward a product. Not that everyone in indie RPGs has to view their job as making a lot of money through selling games or anything like that, but even just to realize games, to have them out in the world. How do you have an audience, and then also to print things physically. That's kind of another reason why for me I've become so obsessed with it. Is it's so hard to make the print product at all and make it any good, I find. I mean, you can just like do a Xerox, like if you have a printer at home, but ink is expensive and whatever. So yeah, I was curious, because it looks like you do have print editions of a lot of your products. So I was curious if that, like, how you've come to decide, like, all right, I want to do a Kickstarter. How do you set the goals? And are you hoping to have these books widely available? I mean, is that part of your design process, or is it just like, I know maybe there are people for whom that's like not the motivating thing, right? The print edition.
It's interesting. I probably went at least 2 years without having any print edition, mainly because at the time, for quite a while actually, I was afraid. I had a lot of debts, and I was afraid of owning stock because I worried it would be subject to asset seizure or whatever. So for about the first 2 years, I just didn't print anything, and I think I did briefly get set up with some print on demand places, mainly just so I could order my own books to me, so I had them there. And I then started getting stuff printed last year. It would have been, actually, was the first time. There it worked out that I was doing a convention with Soul Muppet in the UK, and I ended up printing some zines to sell with them. And at first I wasn't set up with my own store. I was just selling through them at first, and I started selling for other places. But a lot of the physical stuff I was doing at that time, it was printed like sort of against money I was getting paid for individual jobs or stuff. And there was some other stuff like helping me get set up into certain channels, from like winning the DGA Designer Award, and like that also meant I had money that I could then later print some of my own books, which gradually that went away because I used it to get out of the debt, which is why I worried about not being able to print books in the first place. But so when I was doing my first Kickstarter, Terminal, like wanting to have like a really big, nice print edition was definitely part of it. I couldn't have made Terminal, which was a collaboration between me and a brilliant artist called Gormangeist, and was a really big book, and also hired loads of goals. I couldn't have made that even post like DGA win without having some money from Kickstarter. To be honest with Terminal, I probably still like overdid it. I think I maybe underpaid myself a little compared to what might have been ideal. But yeah, it's just like, oh, to make that happen, I need to do this. But even so, at the time when I did Terminal last year, I was working as a teacher, and I was sort of thinking, like, I've really enjoyed this. I want to sort of seize the moment of making RPGs, because definitely at the time it felt like, oh, I feel like you work a long time to get more sort of like recognition than you've maybe had before. And I felt like, oh, I want to like try and like strike while this is hot, which is not necessarily how things actually work. But there was some pressure on myself in my mind there to try and start doing more stuff. Then this year, really since last September, I ended up leaving teaching. And because of like a mix of like physical ability and stuff, I was sort of like, I think my best shot for having a job at the moment is to try and make TTRPGs my job. So I went into this Psycho Dungeon Kickstarter with a very different mindset. A lot more sort of focus on, you know, my budget needed to be a lot better. There was like rougher estimates in Terminal. I needed to make sure, like, how am I making sure I'm okay? I was also focusing a lot on like, what is the most I can do while hopefully making this work. There's, yeah, some of the attraction of Kickstarter, I guess, is being able to do things that are bigger. This moment in my life, I'm like, oh, I made a big game that I liked and released on my itch last year. No, this year actually, called Godslingers. And I jokingly referred to Godslingers as with some friends of mine as a direct to itch game, where I was like, yeah, I released it online. I think the concept is a bit niche, or at least hard to explain. I don't think I can tweet Godslingers well. I can sell it to people verbally. I don't think I can do a good tweet about it. So I was like, I don't want to risk trying to take this through Kickstarter. So I liked the idea. I got the idea out.
This is the Jack Kirby
part of me in my mind. Yeah. I really like Godslingers. But I remember thinking, I don't know how widely it appeals. I didn't feel safe doing a Kickstarter. That's
fair, but
luck, and also it's all dependent on other people.
I mean, this looks amazing to me. If one humble person's opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it raises another question, which there's so much to touch on, but art and design. Like, are you doing all the art and design? Are you collaborating with folks? It is a little different, and I'll say this is something, you know, again, I feel like, Chris, you and I have talked about whatever, but when you're just doing it all yourself, yeah, do you pay yourself versus when you're working with other people and you have to like pay them or you have to cover certain costs? So yeah, I mean, how did that factor in, if you don't mind me asking? Because Godslingers seems very visually driven to call to mind the psychedelic art of the 60s and 70s, whatever era, right? But the sort of Jack Kirby, we're in space, but we're also like kind of in the Cold War, but we're also kind of doing drugs. I mean, it's just its own thing.
We're also kind of killing gods, or maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, are we gods? Like, some of us are gods. I don't know. Like,
maybe
the
we
rules
are.
were real loose in the New Gods. Yeah, but I mean,
also
feel free to plug that book. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Godslingers, I really enjoyed that game, and it's one I'd love to print. I'm just like, I feel like I'd maybe put a lot of money down and then be pitching and maybe be stuck with stuff in that sense.
Sure.
So for Godslingers, I sourced all public domain art, and I did all of that sourcing and stuff myself because I'm the layout artist for all of my own work. I'll probably always be my own layout artist because I enjoy doing layout. But the art itself, yeah, for Godslingers, it was sourced from different places. For other projects I've made, Swamp Creature uses a mix of like stock art, public domain illustrations from children's books, and then a earlier version of the sort of weird digital collage I've done in Psycho Dungeon. Wild Duelist, a sort of a medieval action game I did, would do like collage basically of like medieval era paintings or illustrations with animal heads, because it was all sort of anthropomorphic animals. And yeah, so in terms of paying people, like, it was the first time I collaborated was the first time I did a Kickstarter. I hired an artist and I hired an editor, and I sort of like trusted them about their rates there. And also, at least at that time, my pay was sort of what was left over. And I don't think that was necessarily the greatest estimation of how to have done things. It was fine at that time because I was like, it wasn't my only job. But definitely going into the Psycho Dungeon Kickstarter, there was way more of a focus in my mind of, oh, okay, I need to make sure I'm paid. Psycho Dungeon was also in its own way, to some extent, me figuring out, there's an element of an experiment to its visual presentation, which is I hired Jess Kaczynski to do cover. The cover's absolutely gorgeous. I hired an editor again, Alyssa Ridley, who's the brilliant editor on Terminal, so I was excited to work with her again. But then for everything else in the game, at least at the start, my idea has been like, how much of this can I do? And how good enough is my work? Good enough is maybe a overly value-based judgment. Do an audience enjoy what they get, the impression of my work in all of these different areas, enough that they will buy it? To some extent, this is me sort of asking myself, can I do more things where I am like the main one managing art? Either by using a lot of like cool layout and design to sort of jazz up things, even though I don't consider myself a visual artist. Or is it like, no, I need to start building my projects with a sort of artist budget, which would be also its own thing. But yeah, in terms of going into this project and making sure I paid myself, I don't always break down like the cost of everything I've done, mainly because I feel like I'd either have to stop saying what I am like paying myself at a market rate, which would feel weird, or I'd start feeling guilty about overworking or whatever. So I sort of budgeted for an amount. I genuinely had to do this because at the moment I'm on like universal credit, which is like the British welfare system. So I need to make sure like, okay, getting a big dose of money and all at once messes with that. I need to make sure enough money is set aside for me so that I am safe. That was the starting goal. How much is enough that I get like a month's normal safety? But with the way Psycho Dungeon's set up, everything that's gone over beyond sort of expanding printing costs will go to me. So I've paid myself via, I guess, profit, but also set up the original goal so that like it wouldn't happen in a way unless I was getting paid like a sort of bare minimum.
Yeah, I think that sounds reminiscent, I think, of a lot of creators, is you're trying to meet a certain floor, and then there is no ceiling. I mean, you could always make more, and that's like a great problem to have. And maybe you add stretch goals, you add more content, but yeah, at the end of the day, you don't know how much you're going to make. And certainly I've definitely felt those pressures around, can I afford to just do this or do more of this compared to different kinds of work that pays maybe more or more stably, but is like not fun or not as fun. Yeah. So yeah, no, definitely feel you on trying to sort of figure out the structure better. And I definitely think that's one of the interesting things with the indie RPG space is there are so many people coming to write or otherwise design games who are then becoming art directors, layout artists, and like business people and trying to do the math and work backwards. And ultimately marketers, because that's the other piece, is then you have to figure out, okay, how do I reach people? You can't just put it on Kickstarter and be like, go Kickstarter, do it. That's not really how, Kickstarter works. It's like you have a press kit, so there's all these like skills that you like acquire as you go. Chris, sorry, I don't mean to be rambling.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say, God really would how Kickstarter worked. That would be amazing. Or any social media, for that matter.
Yeah. So, in terms of the Kickstarter, you have I think 3 days left as we're speaking now. Monday.
Yeah, it will end on Thursday, 4 p.m. British summertime, which I'm not actually
It's like
sure
Thursday
what time
morning, late morning our time, something like that.
Yeah, that would make sense. It's the time it's the time of day that most Kickstarters launch. It's not the time most end. That's always just a 30-day after whatever. But yeah, it will end that Thursday. So there's still some like stretch goals to hit before then, which I'd be excited. The next one coming up is like a more sort of in-depth pre-written dungeon scenario that I'd add to the game.
Nice.
Very nice.
And this is all going to be in one book, or and do you see it as can you see it in your mind? Can you describe the book? I don't know, I love the physical part of this whole shtick.
So this will all be in one book, which is everything I've written. I've never explored the sort of multi-zine space like I know like Death Game was originally planned in that area. But yeah, I'm imagining it as like an A4 soft cover book. I've worked out a lot of the big picture layout stuff in some of the samples you can see on the Kickstarter page. One of the early art pieces I did, someone said it reminded them of Game Boy Advance art, and that for some reason got me prompted where like the way I've tried to style a lot of the layout I've done already, and the style I'll try and carry through the whole book is like a mashup of like a sort of Game Boy video game manual as well as like an actual workplace instruction manual. As well as maybe also like a guidebook or an information pamphlet, like those kind of those kind of different languages.
I also get the vibe of like late 90s, early 2000s Macintosh handbooks and things like that. It has I don't even really know what that aesthetic is called, but it really like it's taking me back to the time of like Jelly Game Boys and Jelly Macs and stuff like that.
It's like it is an interesting specific style, which I think is a kind of slice of a period, because the game manual, I guess, didn't comparatively last so long. But yeah, I'm really excited about how it'll be looking. Like I said, there's like the gorgeous wraparound cover by Jess Kaczynski, and then on the interior, when I'm my own person, mainly in charge of like visuals, the way I tend to approach layout is I lay out the text, and then I find spaces I have for images, and I often build images around those spaces I have, which is not how I ever approach things when I work with other people, because that's would be an absurd way to direct an artist. There I'll like leave space or maybe estimate stuff sometimes and then shift things like in response to that, which to be fair, I'll still do with my own work. But it means I've done a lot of art already for this while in the interest of promoting stuff. But I've not done much more of the sample layout other than what I did, because the first step after the Kickstarter will be like Alyssa's going to take a big dive into the whole project. We'll go over that. I don't exactly know how long that will take, but I'm excited to see how she comes along and makes the game better. And then I'll proceed to lay out from there, and I'll try and keep backers and stuff updated all of the way.
Nice. Yeah. So you built in the editorial and proofing process into it, and maybe some rewrites or additions given stretch goals and whatnot. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's so many directions we could take it. I would love to talk about some other games as well, but I also want to make sure, we've said anything about Psycho Dungeon you want to make sure people know. Chris, do you have any questions that we haven't covered in terms of sort of the game itself? I know it's a token-based system, so belonging outside belonging, right? So I don't know if there's anything else just play-wise that you want to say about kind of the actual mechanics. That's also something we often kind of nerd out about. I am always curious just about playtests and how it's gone with other people. I don't know if you've had a chance to play it with randos beyond your friend group or just like friends, and see sort of how that shaped the game. I know you gave some examples earlier, a little bit of kind of the client and how you built that collectively, but
yeah, it's mainly been play tested in my sort of own friend group. I was really hoping to sort of do some con games when I went to UK Games Expo, but then I was just between other stuff getting sorted on the Kickstarter, I didn't get that planned in time. Yeah, a lot of like the individual inspirations for small bits of world building came from within the play tests. The moves, yeah, it's like token-based moves. So you have 3 kind of moves, like as a psycho plumber at least, where vulnerable moves are where you gain a token, lateral moves are where you can give a token to another player, or strong moves are where you spend a token to do something. What I find interesting about doing this in like an action context is that like a lot of the moves are just really like massive swings. Like virtually everyone has a strong move, which is just destroy a monster. Because it is often this sort of exchange, because destroying a monster in Psycho Dungeon is one of the easiest things to do. In the same way, it's very easy for the dungeon to make more monsters. They're just sort of like allegories and representations, whereas the more sort of bigger swing, meaningful to the client, strong moves are the ones where it's not just about making the move, it's also about like, what does that mean for a character? How are you sort of conveying them? But it is always fun to see the different interpretations of destroy a monster, especially when the individual playbooks are stylized so far apart in some ways, like detail wise.
Yeah, it has strong like go. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to ask, or say, yeah, that was one question that I had. Is there combat? How does that work? Like, what is? I mean, I'm assuming that the destroy monster move is kind of like a one thing, but is there a focus on combat, or is it more about just trying to navigate this person's trauma in a physical form?
Yeah, so there's not like any sort of detailed broken down like a combat system. So if you're doing a fight scene or any sort of instance of violence, you are having to handle it in a kind of like free form way. The tokens can like guide that a little, in the sense of you have like, oh, destroying a monster, some of your vulnerable tokens, some of your vulnerable moves allow you to gain tokens by, putting yourself in riskier positions within a fight. But otherwise, it's more handled by, the sort of negotiation, I think, and the discussion of what a fight or what a scuffle looks like in its broad strokes, rather than in the beat by beat way. It's definitely an interesting choice on my part to describe it as an action game while not having big combat, but I think its action can be a lot of bigger things, and sometimes it is these big scenes where you are just blowing up a monster with your move that lets you do that however you desire.
I love that there's a focus away from just combat, because when you hear the word dungeon, you would assume dungeon crawl, and it's going to have these kind of like set presuppositions about it. But yeah, being able to kind of break away from that while still being kind of in the genre is really interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder also about how big moves, because even in action movies, if you had to realistically like there's action movies that realistically portray combat, and then there's good action movies which don't do that. They're just big swings. They're big narrative moments, because you don't really want to see people getting shot realistically, which often would, I think, when you see these kind of, I think they're very American, very in vogue more, I think probably on the right, but the kind of realistic like Afghanistan-esque movie, it's like people just fall over dead, and there's not, the good action movies make it emotional by having a kind of Michael Bay effect or Fast Furious effect or James Bond musical role, or the bad guy has a crazy scar. I mean, they sort of add the audio and the visual in order to get to the emotion. So I think a good TTRPG, maybe by analogy, this is a hypothesis, but is using dice or cards or tokens or something to add something that isn't necessarily simulationist, but is getting at an emotional truth. And also, I think there's something goofy, to be honest, about the whole psychoplumbing scenario, which I really like, and it
Yeah.
calls to mind for me like Ghostbusters. You know, this idea of a narrative
Yeah,
structure
yeah.
of there's always a haunting. It's a different haunting. It's very serious, and the ghost could kind of maybe kill you, but also like everyone in the show is like, yeah, we'll get rid of the ghost. Don't worry. Like they're more arguing with each other. Their pet ghost who works for them or something. You know, it's like it's got a very odd tone where on the one hand it's very deadly serious, but on the other hand it's like a goofy comedy. And I think to your point, it's more about the workers, their relationships, and over time, you know, if it wasn't a kids show, thinking of the cartoon version, you know, it could have explored those things in more depth. So I think something about trading tokens and thinking about who is vulnerable when, as opposed to, you know, maybe fighting a monster that's like the equivalent of a goblin in D&D, you're not really vulnerable. You're not going to die from that encounter. So that's not a vulnerable move. That's something else, right? And the vulnerability move might be sharing an intimate moment with a coworker and admitting something or confronting something. So I think that does make a kind of sense there. Yeah, there's so many other games that we could probably just go through each game in turn all night. But yeah, I think one question that we talked a little bit about before the show is you know, always what's next, you know, so beyond, since I think many of us are always thinking about like 2 projects ahead, or I wish I could do this.
Yeah.
But what else you'd like to do, you know, in the future with Psycho Dungeon and or any new projects? So I don't know. That's one question that jumps to mind.
Yeah, I'm excited to find out what comes next. I'm going to see where the sort of dust settles a bit post the Psycho Dungeon campaign. I'll need to, I guess, like also look at the drawing board and see, like, cool, is this working as a job, as a living? And I hope I can make it work. But a project I do have lined up that I think, regardless of anything else, will almost definitely be happening. Probably coming out like earliest, I'd reckon September. Latest, I could see around November happening. But I'm going to work on a sequel to Transgender Deathmatch Legend, which will be expanding the game as an anthology of hex crawls, or revise the rules a little, and then just add like 6 new adventures, beat 'em up adventures across sort of like lots of different areas. So while the original one was like a simple sort of revenge story, this sequel is going to take in some fun directions where you're getting sort of like raid inspired rages against like gatekeeping healthcare, as well as like sort of like big boss inspired thing, but putting you up against like far right protesters trying to mess with shows, as well as like other kind of revenge things, but like do a more sort of rip from the headlines approach, as well as then some like even goofier wrestling based ones. Like I do totally just rip off the plot of The Warriors, but make it about wrestling. But that's a big plan. The exact shape, that's one where the writing is all done, and a lot of the shape of what that project will be is kind of influenced by like how well other stuff in my career, I guess, is going. And there was at one point a discussion about like working with like a team of artists on it, but it may be that I'm looking at it may be that I end up looking at sort of doing some like photography work with like ex-wrestlers I know, but that's something to still sort of be explored. But that will probably be my next project to come to Kickstarter. Maybe I'll end up writing some smaller things that go up on itch between then that time, in the same way like between Terminal and Psycho Dungeon, like Ritual Magic and Godslingers, and the Hieronymus supplement I did all came out. There's a chance maybe I'd like throw out some other smaller games or smaller sort of zine stuff of just ideas I get excited about and can't get out of my head. But I think like the next big project I'm aiming for is Transgender Deathmatch Legend 2 Grand Slam.
Grand Slam.
Hell yeah. I love that. God, it really does have like a WrestleMania feel to it, which I really appreciate. Vex says we love to slam grandly.
We do love to slam grandly.
Indeed.
I was struggling with the title for so long for the subtitle. I was always like, it's always going to be Transgender Death by Trilogy 2. I kept pitching weird acronyms to people. I kept saying, like, I call it the Get Real Strong Edition. And everyone's like, what? And I was like, because then it stands for GRS. That's really funny. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, I guess. I was like, and Joe was like, what do you want out of a subtitle? What is it different about it? And I was like, well, yes, it's revised, but a big thing is that it's more. There's like loads of
right.
Like, Grand Slam works.
Yeah, and the slam, the rest. I mean, I think there's so much there. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The Warriors has come up a couple times recently thinking about game design, but I think for a reason, it's not just like it's an awesome movie, which it's 100% is
an
amazing
awesome movie. Yes.
But I think also narrative structure, right? It's a really picaresque tale that is not divorced from politics. So it's not a picaresque tale of just random violence or like a random kid struggling with his life or something. And it's like about politics in a way, even though it feels very goofy and you can just watch it to enjoy like
the
guys in
fighting.
Vests. Yeah, street fighting. But it has this linkage where, you know, that each of these almost like Arthurian level encounters that just kind of make no sense. I mean, they just get wackier and wackier. But it's all taking place within the Bronx is Burning era, where there is social upheaval and there's some attempt by certain, you know, factions of the lumpen proletarians to like organize and really make a difference. And what would that mean? And so I think there's actually something kind of perennial and exciting about the Warriors that goes far beyond its kitsch and its cool costuming and all that stuff. And I can see why a lot of designers who are playing around with more political themes might be drawn to it. Or at least that's one reason I was drawn to it again, having kind of grown up with it as just like a goofy, you know, thing in the background. I guess that leads me to, kind of really the last like big question I have, which is just, you know, politics and games, and how do you think about your games in terms of politics, if at all? And, you know, that's however you want to take it. I mean, I know some people we've talked to don't really factor that in as much when they're designing games. They're just focused on the sort of fun experience. But I think it's something we spend a lot of time here thinking about, you know, can games serve, what other kind of conversations can they spark? What other purposes they serve? And I would guess, Kayla, that you have some thoughts on that, but I don't know. What do you think? Can games be more than fun, or are they sort of only fun, or where on the spectrum do you fall? And how have you had any good experiences? Have you seen your game spark some good conversations, or sort of have a didactic role, but without being annoying? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think games are art. And I am a fan of lots of different artistic mediums, and that appreciation of art, I would say, is never just limited straightforwardly to enjoyment. And so, yeah, I think there can be things where you can definitely do games where you're like, this is a good experience. I am having a good time, which is not necessarily the same as I'm enjoying myself or I'm having fun, because that could feel cruel to say, essentially, or weird to say. I also think sometimes you get stuff where it's like doing sort of both all at the same time. My game Terminal was inspired by The Matrix, and like the thing about The Matrix is like that's a kick-ass action film that if you do then just sort of look a bit deeper, you can find plenty of different angles on it, either like about dealing with like politics, about dealing with maybe like personal agency, about dealing with like a transition narrative, essentially. And I think that's the thing of a lot of my games. I think there's always this first layer, which is like the sort of straightforward version of it, but I always do want there to be depth. I did not intend Psychodungeon to... when I set out to write Psychodungeon, I did not set out to intend to write a political satire, but actually a lot of the review quotes I got of it said like, oh, this is a very sort of satirical piece. It's partly, I guess, like my initial premise. I thought of like psychoplumbers going in to clear out brain dungeons. I think that, like, I guess, led itself to commentary, especially the moment I started comparing the character to a therapist or a thing. I think a lot of the political commentary in Psycho Dungeon came from the emotions I wanted to be channeling. And so when I did that, I drew on my own emotions and my own feelings. Psycho Dungeon ended up a lot informed by my time having worked as a teacher. It was a lot informed by various therapy I'd done as a patient, not as anything else. It was inspired by like the fact that like my mum had worked in social care modes. And so, you know, drawing on those experiences, it's impossible for political commentary to not enter into that space. Commentary maybe is or political observations or understandings or whatever. So I don't think like the aim of anything like Psycho Dungeon or really anything I've done has been to be aiming to teach in that sense, but they're all to explore different ideas. Terminal is, you know, that's like I said, it's digital pirate action. It's cool. It's swashbuckling cyberpunk stuff. There's also very much a potential to play out a sort of abuse survivor narrative in a allegorical space there. That same setting, though, could be used to do a metaphor for, something more sort of political, maybe focus more on sort of resisting fascism, or sort of more everyday, I suppose, if someone wanted to do it about being like a sort of coming of age, understanding your own body narrative. Like, there's what I intended and there's what I've tried to evoke, but then there is that sort of like surface layer thing, and I think the surface layer, I think I do often when describing stuff say like, oh yeah, it could allegorically be this, but I don't think of this as allegory in the sense of being a straight one-for-one, and if you don't interpret it that way, you've done it wrong. I look at it more as like this is what I was thinking, and this is what I was going for, but, you know, if I'm saying I think games are art, I'm also, I guess, saying I'm an author, and as an author, I'm obviously sort of dead from my own interpretation. I think, in terms of what I'm aiming for and where more sort of commentary comes into my games, I guess it's a lot of semiotics, maybe, like a lot of thinking about like the signifiers and what's been signified. But with games compared to, I guess, books or anything else, as awareness is going to be just like massively transformed by conversations I'm not a part of because they happen at tables I'm not at.
Oh, Chris, you're muted.
I hit the wrong button. I think that it really speaks to there being a lot of bleed from both directions, right? Whether it's like as the author or as the player, like we're going to inherently insert our own lived experiences into the things that we're creating, whether that's, you know, playing as a character or writing the book itself. And yeah, I mean, you know, turns out everyday life is pretty political, so it's going to come through in some way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How could we not be making games based on our experiences, right? And fairly profound ones too. I mean, even just like having also taught, it's very different, I find, than other sorts of jobs, office jobs, where you're among other adults, because you're not necessarily among other adults, and your relationship to people is so differently hierarchical, even than a job where, again, you might have a boss, but you know, they sort of disappear a lot. I mean, when you're teaching, it's this weird performance, and it raises kind of, I think, you know, those kinds of Freudian questions about how society reproduces itself and how are norms transferred. Like, how are you communicating, even without intending to, just by being there, certain sense of normalcy or right and wrong or whatever. So I can imagine how that would if you're a critical thinker, thoughtful person, that becomes part of the design of your games. Just like in other instances, yeah, we've talked with other creators about how their various experiences have led them to make certain kinds of games. Obviously, if you wear really cool vests, you're going to make a game about the Warriors because it's just no.
You wear really cool vests and nothing else. That's your entire
And nothing else. That's your
personality.
wardrobe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Vest game. Vex did make a cool game about shirts, so I have to say Big Tough Shirt Guys is literally a game
it's
about shirts.
all possible.
It's all out there. Chris, do you have more questions or thoughts that you wanted to chat with Kayla about?
No, I'm feeling good. I don't know. How do you feel about it? I feel satisfied by this interview.
Yeah. No, I want to play Psycho Dungeon. I want to get the book and read it. It sounds really good.
I do really want to play Psycho Dungeon. Very, very much so. Yeah. I guess one last thought about the teachers being psycho plumbers thing. There is kind of a one-to-one, at least I don't know the state of education in the UK, Kayla, but, it's like teachers are getting screwed in this country. It's really bad. I only taught for a very short period of time, but I worked as an organizer for a teachers union, and that was 10 years ago. It was bad then. It's worse now. But, you're entrusted with the care of young people, of young minds. You're entrusted with the thing that's supposed to make democracy work, quote unquote, which is public education, and it just keeps getting swept out from under you. It's rough. And so it does feel like an underappreciated job, even though it is so complex. Which again, wouldn't want to be a psycho plumber.
Definitely, I ended up quitting teaching for a mix of reasons. Some was finding ultimately like the British mainstream school system just not an environment I felt comfortable being a part of always. Which maybe sounds so. I was briefly looking at like different educational sort of directions, like more sort of SEN environments were appealing to me. But then like the other thing that ended up being a big seal is, in spite of there being a massive teaching shortage in the UK, with people quitting the profession en masse, what the UK government decided was the most important thing was to ban teachers from mentioning trans people at all. So that was a part of my leaving it behind. But there was also mixed feelings. Like, there's definitely like, that was a reason I'd never go back. Mm-hmm. I was troubled by like the level of sort of authority and a lot of like the systems in play with it. But also I had sort of hard days. I think like the thing is, there's sort of a degree regret impulse in the Wizard playbook is definitely about teaching. But then I guess like the other sort of like thing that ended up just being a big part of it was the thing my mum said to me when she left a job when I was a kid, of not wanting to do another job where it was following them home. She continued to work in social care, obviously. But and I remember thinking about that because I'd really wanted to avoid that because of the way my mum had said it, and I grew up, and when I was teaching, I noticed it happen. And I think that happens if you've got like this big impulse to care. I think I cared so much, which I think made me a good teacher, and also is plausibly why I couldn't last as a teacher. I just think it ate me up a bit there.
Yeah. Speaking of narratives, I've thought about it in terms of game design rarely, but sometimes when I first started teaching college, I remember speaking with a mentor who's a lot older, taught college for a long time at Brooklyn College, where I did my master's. And he said, you'll meet people. I mean, I was young. I was like 24 or whatever, and was teaching people, many of whom were older than me. Some were a little younger or around the same age, but people going for their undergrad when I was doing my master's, it's not like they were all, kids or something. But this guy, Bob Viscusi, who's more senior in the English department, said, many of the people you'll teach have already made the major mistake in their life by the time they decide to do college as an adult in the city university system. And you can't like fix that. Like you can't help them with like insert here like major issue that they're bringing into the classroom. And these are already adults, so I can only imagine how much harder it is with kids. And you see sort of more heartbreaking things that you feel maybe you can fix and there is time and all that, but yet that's not your remit, and or there's all these limitations, as you're saying, being imposed on the outside, or from the outside rather, on your like performance as a teacher and your ability to care. But yeah, maybe there's some small way in which games can allow us to do different forms of care and or explore some of these themes, even if we're not able to, or not currently doing them in the same way in the classroom. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I don't know, Kayla, do you have other deep thoughts you want to share with us tonight, or is this a good place to leave it? We can do a final plug. Yeah, leave it on some.
Yeah,
get deep
I'm
with
happy
it.
to go to a final plug.
Okay.
Public education is dead. What are you plugging?
Yes.
So terrible for doing an interview and then randomly going into just dark things that have informed my game design, because I'm just excited to share. So I'm going.
We asked you. I mean,
yeah, that's what we're. That's what we're here for.
That happened to me, and this is why I made this game. No, anytime else, I'm like,
that's real.
Maybe I didn't need to. Yeah.
I Wythe already thanked you, so I think I can speak for both of us. But yeah, I think we appreciate that. Like, we appreciate people being honest about what goes into what they're making and putting out into the world. And you're a very caring and thoughtful person, and yeah.
Thank you.
No need to apologize.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your games with the world, and today some of your thoughts on game design with us. And yeah, we look forward to Psycho Dungeon. Maybe we'll have you back on when you have this next project. The Grand Slam re-up version of transgender deathmatch legend. Moving forward. It'll be really fun to say the proper title all at once. I will nail it when we have you back.
We're gonna practice.
Yeah, we'll practice.
Awesome.
Yeah, so yeah, go ahead. On that note, I guess everyone. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
We have a bit of a lag.
Yeah,
there's a lag. I think.
If you do want to, about the lag. If you do want to back Psycho Dungeon and there's still time left, best way to find that is psychodungeon.ratwave.uk. If I've said anything and you're like, God, I wish I knew more about this, go to either my blog at ratwave.uk or my TikTok, where I've just done like loads of videos and posts about so many different aspects of the game, as many as I can think of.
Very nice. Well, we'll put that in the chat here, and then also for those listening to the podcast, you can find ratwave.uk down below in the text area, whatever that's called.
Yeah, the
words,
the below part words of the podcast. Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say, Kayla. Thanks for putting up with some internet issues and all that. Show notes. That is the word. Thank you, Vex. There
Show
is the
notes.
For that. We're journalists, kind of.
God, what would we do without you?
That's great. So with that, thank you again, Kayla Dice of Ratwave Gamehouse, which could refer either to a new style or just a big old tsunami of rodents coming at you.
You choose.
Choose your own adventure. And this has been Why We Roll. Found out a little more about why some folks roll, and one of the reasons, vests. So everyone have a great night, have fun gaming, and we'll see you back in a couple weeks.
All right, thanks everybody.
End stream. Bye. Thank you, Kayla.